You know, I'm often asked what it was like to grow up with Danny, and I could never really figure out how to answer that. I mean, it was all I knew. You may have well have asked me how it felt to grow up with my sisters. No picnic, by the way. But okay, let's talk about it. It was magical. I wish you could have been there. It was an absolute celebration of living. Every day, Danny exposed his innocence, his raw emotions, his capacity to love. Danny was born with a heart murmur, but for the rest of his life, he was our family's roaring heartbeat. To outsiders, he may have seemed slowed by his handicaps, but he had the absolute freedom to be unapologetically himself. And yet all he wanted to be was like Linda and Misty and me. He wanted an allowance. He wanted to go to school, to have a girlfriend, to play a sport. At dinner, we all teased each other, and we gave it to Danny in equal proportions, and he gave it right back. We learned early on that whatever pace we set, he would try to match it. Limitations were elastic. Down syndrome, for Danny, they should have called it up syndrome. Danny made every day entertaining. He loved Dukes of Hazzard. He once rolled down the car window when I was angry with him and called for the help of Luke and Bo. There was the time that Danny was receiving an award at a Special Olympics banquet, and when Danny went up to accept his award, he stopped, held up the award, and declared, "This one's for OJ." And Danny loved to sing. We'd go for a drive, and he would sing loudly and so far off key, I think he was inventing new notes. And he would always be about 3 words behind. We didn't care. Back in the late 1970s, the Bee Gees had a popular song called "More Than a Woman." More than a woman to me. Well, what Danny thought they were singing, and he sang, was "Bald-headed woman." So yes, it was wonderful, but it wasn't always easy. The world can sometimes be unkind. Wherever we went, people would stop and stare, sometimes make a comment, sometimes move out of the way. It's where I first witnessed the human capacity for intolerance. We learned early on that we all had an obligation to make life for Danny as normal as possible. There was no wiggle room there. Our needs were important, but Danny's were paramount. I doubt there's anyone here who doesn't know what Danny was able to accomplish athletically. He was an Olympic athlete in everything, but probably not many of you know how his Olympic journey began. His first sport was track and field, and he was fast. The first time he competed in the 100-yard dash, he was so far ahead of everybody else that he turned to see where the other runners were. And as he did, he slowed down, and somebody passed him and won the race. Well, from then on, every night, without fail, my dad would gather us on the sidewalk and we'd run the 100-yard dash, just slightly behind. The idea was for Danny not to look behind, for Danny not to ever look back. And it worked. He never looked back, literally and figuratively. And that's just what we did. Our family created a mystical alternate universe. We bent and tilted and shaped the world so that Danny would never see himself as different, so that he felt an equal player in it. He would be able to read, to do math, to make his own lunch, perform chores, be a church usher, work at a grocery store. Danny attended Huntsville High School. One spring, my sister, Linda, asked Danny if he had a prom date yet. He didn't, so she convinced him to call the girls in his class. Of course, he had all their numbers. But by then, all of them had dates, and Danny was inconsolable. So Linda took the world and tilted it. She told him she would go to the high school prom with him. And Danny was thrilled and showed off his sister. This is what we did. High school eventually was done with Danny, but he wasn't really done with it. He continued to buy the yearbooks, go to games, and over time, he started to pine to go to college. For years, he talked about it. I have letters from him where he was narrowing down his choices. It was heartbreaking. A year or so ago, my mom got the bright idea to start Danny Nelson University. a made-up school where she could work with him to sharpen his skills as he embarked down the road of aging, but also to give him the idea that he was going to college, to bend the world again, because this is what we did. As we created this world for Danny, moving the obstacles out of Danny's path and softening the heartbreaks, a remarkable thing began to happen. You joined us in the bending and the tilting. You became our co-conspirators. You talked to Danny about football, took him to games. You teased him. You put him to work. You became his coach. You accepted him. Your kids became his friends and protectors. Back when we used to run that 100-yard dash with Danny in the neighborhood, it wasn't long before the neighborhood kids would join. And there would be a dozen or more people lined up each night to run with Danny, because that's what you did. You put Danny at the center. You indulged his idiosyncrasies, tolerated his flip-flops from Alabama to Auburn to LSU and back to Alabama. You brought him joy. And yet I suspect that your motivation wasn't in helping us create this alternate universe. It's because your lives too were enriched. Anyway, there'd always come an end to the fun, to the day, to the silliness, to the stadiums, the accolades, the applause, the newspaper articles. When these days were over, we just had Danny. And really, that was enough. Imagine what it would be like to wake up every day and see yourself as bigger than life in someone else's eyes. Imagine knowing that no matter how badly you screwed up, you had a confessor whose penance was simply a hug. And just when you told yourself he probably didn't quite understand, he'd say something that told you he did, because that's what he did. And that's what it was like growing up with Danny. It's been an amazing life. A better question now would be, what will it be like without him? And this is all we've ever known. Linda, Misty, and I, we've all gone on with our lives, formed careers, and raised families, but there's really only ever been the Nelsons with Danny. He was our center, our roaring heartbeat. And I know that for the rest of my life, I'll hear his voice, singing along a few words behind and extremely off-key, like the world was made just for him.